Imagine being so sure a man is stupid that every time he succeeds, you become even more convinced it must have been luck. He has almost no education, his writing is a mess. He embarrasses himself in public, makes business decisions that sound like jokes, and somehow keeps getting richer. The first time, you call it luck. The second time, ridiculous luck. By the third or fourth, though, that explanation starts getting uncomfortable. Either Timothy Dexter was the luckiest fool anyone had ever met, or the people laughing at him weren't nearly as good at recognizing intelligence as they thought they were. That was the problem Dexter created for almost everyone around him. And more than 200 years later, he creates the same problem for us. Because the interesting question isn't really whether Timothy Dexter was stupid, it's why people felt so sure that he was. And then, once he became rich, why we become tempted to make the opposite mistake and search for hidden genius in everything he did. Both reactions come from something we do constantly. We confuse a decision with the way that decision happened to turn out. Dexter may be one of the strangest examples of that problem ever recorded. He was born in Massachusetts in 1747 with little money and very little formal schooling. As a child, he worked. As a teenager, he learned the leather trade, and that was most of his education. Nothing about him matched the kind of man people expected to become a wealthy merchant. Then, in his early 20s, Dexter married Elizabeth Frothingham, a widow with property and money. Suddenly, the poor leather worker had something he had never really had before: capital. What he didn't suddenly acquire though was respectability. Dexter was still crude, poorly educated, and socially awkward. And this matters because none of us walks around directly measuring other people's intelligence. We use clues: how someone speaks, where they studied, what they do for work, how they dress, whether people with status take them seriously. Those clues aren't meaningless, but they are shortcuts. Your brain takes them, compresses them, and pretty quickly decides what kind of person it's looking at: smart, successful, educated, fool. Then the label starts doing some of the thinking for you. A respected investor takes a huge risk, and it looks like conviction. A man you've already decided is an idiot takes the same risk, and it looks reckless. Dexter was about to make one of those risks. During and after the American Revolution, American paper money and revolutionary debt had collapsed in value. Confidence was awful. Some of the paper was changing hands for tiny fractions of what it had once been worth. People wanted out. Dexter bought in. He started accumulating paper that other people were desperate to get rid of. Picture this from the outside. A man you already think has no business handling serious money is taking real wealth and exchanging it for stacks of paper everyone around him thinks may never recover. If Dexter had lost everything there, nobody would have needed a complicated explanation. Of course, he lost it. Look what the idiot did. Except he didn't. The new American government eventually reorganized and funded revolutionary debt. Assets people had practically abandoned became much more valuable. Dexter made a fortune. And here's the annoying part. Now that you know he made money, the trade doesn't sound quite as stupid anymore. It starts to feel bold, maybe clever, maybe even visionary. But Dexter didn't become smarter after the result came in. The only thing that changed is that we learned how the bet ended. There is a name for this: outcome bias. We judge the quality of a decision using information that didn't exist when the decision was made. Someone takes a gamble and wins, and suddenly the gamble looks brilliant. The same person loses. And now everybody can see it was obviously reckless. Put your entire life savings on one roulette number and win. You're rich. Still doesn't make roulette a retirement plan. Maybe the people around Dexter really did underestimate him, but because we know he won, we can go too far in the other direction and start giving him certainty he may never have had. Maybe Dexter understood exactly what would happen. Maybe he noticed something other people missed. Or maybe he made a very large gamble. And it happened to work. One win doesn't tell us much. Unfortunately for everyone who thought he was an idiot, Dexter kept going. Now he had money. What he still wanted was respect. Newburyport had established merchants, old families, and educated men who knew what a successful person was supposed to look like. Dexter wanted into that world. That world did not seem especially eager to have him. And this is where the stories around Timothy Dexter start sounding less like business history and more like somebody telling a joke. Some later accounts say merchants began giving him deliberately terrible business advice, hoping he would finally wipe himself out. Not mildly bad ideas, ideas that sounded impossible to profit from. It's hard to know how literally every detail in those later stories should be taken. But the trades became inseparable from Dexter's reputation. The most famous early example involved bed warming pans. A bed warming pan was a long handled metal container filled with hot coals. You moved it through the sheets to warm a freezing bed during a New England winter. Perfectly useful product in Massachusetts. Dexter reportedly bought tens of thousands of them. Some accounts put the number above 40,000. Then he sent them to the West Indies. 40,000 tools built to warm freezing beds headed for the Caribbean. That's not just the wrong market, that's almost the opposite market. It's like shipping snow shovels to the desert. If you already believed Dexter was an idiot, this must have been satisfying. Finally. Here was the trade too stupid for luck to save. Then the ships came back with profit. According to the traditional story, the warming pans were adapted for use in the molasses trade. Somebody looked at those long handled metal pans and noticed something Dexter's critics had ignored. The name of the product didn't matter, it shaped it. It didn't have to warm a bed, it could be useful somewhere else. None of that proves Dexter planned the final use. Maybe he did. Maybe the people working for him were clever. Maybe somebody improvised when the cargo arrived. We don't know. And honestly, that uncertainty makes the story better. Because if you're one of the people laughing at him, you don't need a complicated answer yet. Fluke. Fine. One ridiculous trade worked. Then came woolen mittens. Again, according to the stories, Dexter sent them toward a warm part of the world. Winter clothing, tropical destination. Same problem. Except the shipment supposedly found buyers connected to colder regions. The mittens sold, now it's twice. Still possible. Then came cats, an actual shipment of cats. Not tools, not grain, not lumber. Cats, which sounds ridiculous. Until you remember that islands with serious rodent problems suddenly make cats quite useful. The animals reportedly found buyers. At this point, calling it a business strategy starts feeling generous. But calling all of it luck is getting awkward too. Worthless paper made him money. Bed warmers in the tropics made him money. Mittens in warm weather made him money. Cats made him money. Then came the trade that should have ended the argument coal to Newcastle. That sounds less absurd today, unless you know what Newcastle meant at the time. Newcastle was famous for coal, so famous that carrying coals to Newcastle had already become an expression for doing something pointless. You did not send coal to Newcastle. Newcastle was where the coal came from. It was practically a proverb for stupidity. And Dexter reportedly did it anyway. He loaded coal onto ships and sent it to the place famous for having, if there was ever a point where everyone around him could finally say, there, he's finished, this was it. Except, according to the traditional story, Dexter's shipment arrived during a temporary disruption in local supply. For a brief moment, the city that supposedly could never need his coal needed coal, and Dexter had it. One version of the story says the shipment sold at a huge premium, and that he came home with a barrel and a half of silver. The thing people already used as a metaphor for pointless behavior had somehow become profitable. At this point, the real problem isn't Dexter anymore. It's the explanation. If you've already decided he's stupid, what could he possibly do to prove you wrong? If he loses money, he's stupid. If he makes money, he's lucky. If he makes money again, he's very lucky. Keep doing that long enough, and you're no longer testing an opinion, you're protecting a story. Belief perseverance. Once a belief settles in, contradictory evidence doesn't always replace it. Sometimes we bend the new evidence until it fits what we already believed. Someone you thought had no talent succeeds. Lucky break. Someone you think is brilliant fails badly. Bad timing. Either explanation could be true. The problem is when every outcome somehow proves you were right all along. And there's an opposite mistake waiting for us here too. After hearing the warming pans, the mittens, the cats, and the coal, it's tempting to decide that the crowd was the real fool. Maybe consensus is useless. Maybe all the great opportunities are hiding inside ideas everybody else thinks are stupid. That sounds satisfying. It's also a terrible lesson. Most ridiculous ideas do not turn into fortunes. Plenty of them just stay ridiculous. What Dexter's story does reveal is something more useful. Other people's reactions change what we're willing to attempt. There is an old psychology experiment that makes this easier to see. Solomon Ash put people in a room and gave them an almost insultingly simple task. Look at one line and choose which of several other lines matches it. The answer was obvious. Then the other people in the room, who were secretly part of the experiment, confidently chose the wrong one. Some participants followed them. The line hadn't changed. The room had. That's the part that matters here. We don't just ask, is this a good idea? We also ask, what happens to me if everyone else thinks it's a stupid idea? Losing money is one kind of risk. Being the only idiot in town who everybody wants not to do it is another. Imagine those 40,000 warming pans ready to leave for the tropics. If the trade fails, Dexter doesn't just lose money. Everyone gets to laugh. The whole failure becomes proof that he never belonged with serious merchants. Conventional failure doesn't sting in quite the same way. Make the respectable decision everyone else made, and if it goes wrong, nobody saw it coming. Make a bizarre decision alone and fail. Now the failure has your name on it. Maybe that was one of Dexter's actual advantages. Not superior intelligence, not magical business intuition. Maybe he was just unusually hard to embarrass. Most people don't only avoid bad bets, they avoid bets that would make them look ridiculous if they failed. You can see this in smaller ways too. An idea gets watered down until nobody can criticize it. A business never gets started because the first reaction might be laughter. Sometimes that's sensible caution. Sometimes the thing being protected isn't money or probability, it's pride. Dexter, for better or worse, seemed unusually resistant to that pressure. And every once in a while, being willing to look foolish puts you somewhere nobody else was willing to stand. Every once in a while. That part matters because this is where the Timothy Dexter story can really mess with your judgment. Dexter survived. You're hearing about him because he survived. History is full of people who ignored conventional wisdom, made bizarre investments, trusted terrible instincts, and lost everything. You don't know most of their names. Their stories don't get retold for 200 years, they disappear. That filtering effect has a name too: survivorship bias. Take 1,000 people making outrageous bets. 999 go broke. One becomes rich. Which one gets turned into a story about courage? The survivor. Once you only look at that person, the risk starts disappearing from the story. Someone drops out of college and builds a billion-dollar company. Dropping out starts sounding bold. Someone ignores every expert and happens to be right. Now, ignoring experts looks like independence. We see the person standing at the end. We don't see everybody who made a similar choice and never got there. So Dexter cannot prove that being contrarian makes you smart. He shows why successful contrarians are so easy to learn the wrong lesson from. A spectacular result makes uncertainty look much smaller after the fact. And that leaves us in an awkward position. The people around Dexter may have underestimated him because of his education, manners, and behavior. We may overestimate him because we know how the famous stories end. They saw the man and dismissed the results. We see the results and start inventing a mastermind. Dexter's later life doesn't exactly help. Once he became rich, he did not transform into a quiet, polished businessman. He became more Timothy Dexter. He started calling himself Lord Timothy Dexter. In the United States, a country that had just fought a revolution against monarchy, there was no noble title waiting for him. So he more or less gave himself one. Then he turned his estate into a monument to his own importance. Around 40 large wooden statues reportedly stood on the grounds. Political figures, historical figures, famous men. And Timothy Dexter, of course, Timothy Dexter, one inscription associated with him declared him the first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world. He was many things. Subtle was not one of them. He hired Jonathan Plummer, a poet who publicly praised him. Then Dexter wrote a book called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. Thousands of words, wild spelling, chaotic capitalizations, almost no punctuation. Readers complained. Dexter's answer was incredible. A later edition included a page filled with punctuation marks, periods, commas, semicolons, question marks. Instead of fixing the book himself, he essentially told readers to sprinkle them in wherever they liked, pepper and salted to taste. Somehow, this did not make him less memorable. Then Dexter reportedly staged his own funeral. He pretended to be dead so he could see how people reacted. There was a coffin, mourners, a crowd, and Dexter, very much alive, watching from hiding. According to the story, he became angry because his wife wasn't grieving hard enough. There may not be a cognitive bias capable of explaining all of Timothy Dexter, because this is usually the point where the neat secret genius theory starts having problems. Some of this was vanity, some of it was bizarre, some of it may have been calculated, and some of it probably wasn't. We like intelligence to be tidy. If someone is smart, we expect them to sound smart, behave rationally, and make consistently intelligent choices. People don't work that way. A person can have sharp instincts in one area and terrible judgment in another. They can tolerate risk unusually well and still be driven by enormous vanity. Someone can be commercially capable and personally ridiculous. We want one label because one label is easy. Genius, idiot. Dexter doesn't cooperate. And this brings us back to the clues people were using from the beginning: education, refinement, manners, status. Those things can tell us something. They're just not the same thing as ability. Dexter became rich without ever becoming the kind of person those signals said a rich, intelligent man was supposed to be. If this man could succeed, what exactly were all those respectable signals proving? Dexter also spent years wanting recognition from people who never seemed willing to give him enough of it. Eventually, he stopped waiting. If nobody was going to call him a lord, he would. If nobody was going to place him among great men, he could build a statue and put himself there. If educated people mocked his book, they were still reading it. If respectable people laughed at him, they were still talking about Timothy Dexter. Was that brilliant publicity? Maybe. Was it desperate vanity? Probably, at least partly. He may have understood attention. He may also simply have wanted attention very badly. Those aren't the same thing. 200 years later, the result is the same. We're still talking about him. And knowing that ending creates the same problem all over again. Because Dexter became famous, it's easy to give every ridiculous act a strategy. He understood branding, he understood spectacle, he was ahead of his time, maybe. Or maybe a status hungry eccentric behaved outrageously. And outrageous people are hard to forget. We don't get to crawl inside his head and check. We want the winner to have known. We want the loser to have missed something obvious. It makes life easier to explain. But sometimes a good decision loses. Sometimes a terrible one works. Sometimes careful reasoning gets unlucky. Sometimes bad reasoning gets rescued. And every so often, you get Timothy Dexter, where ability, recklessness, timing, stubbornness, useful people, and luck become so tangled that pretending we can separate them perfectly is probably the least intelligent thing we could do. Maybe Dexter knew more than the people around him thought. Maybe he knew much less than we now want to believe. Both can be true. He made terrible looking bets. Some worked for reasons he couldn't control. Some may have worked because he or the people around him saw opportunities others missed. And he seemed almost impossible to shame into behaving like everyone else. After 200 years, we're still trying to decide how much of that was skill and how much was luck. Maybe that's the wrong argument. There is one question that cuts through almost all of it. Would I still call this decision intelligent if the exact same reasoning had produced a loss? Timothy Dexter never gives us a clean answer. That's why he works so well as a test. He makes it very hard to separate the man from the money, the decision from the result, the strange idea from the lucky ending. And maybe that's the distinction his story leaves behind, not genius versus idiot, something harder. Because most of us will never know how many ideas we quietly rejected, not because we proved they were bad, but because we could already picture how stupid we'd look if they failed, looking intelligent and actually being right.